I'm Robin Carhart-Harris. I'm a research fellow at Imperial College London. I work within the Centre for Neuropsychopharmacology within the Division of Medicine and Brain Sciences. So what I'm going to talk about today is the research that we've been doing within the Centre for Neuropsychopharmacology on psychedelic drugs and their effects in the brain and how they may be applied. So a sort of appropriate level to start at when giving this talk is to tell you what are psychedelic drugs for those of you who don't know. So really when we talk about psychedelic drugs, we're talking about the classic psychedelic drugs. The prototypical psychedelic is LSD. Other classic psychedelic drugs include psilocybin, which is a compound found in so-called magic mushrooms that are found throughout the world. Also, the compound dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is another classic psychedelic drug that's found, well, it exists widely in nature. It's even found in our own bodies. And there's a good case to be made that it's also present in our brains. And it's attracted a lot of interest recently because it's also included in an Amazonian brew called ayahuasca, which seems to be becoming increasingly popular. A lot of people traveling over to the Amazon to have an experience with ayahuasca. So the key psychedelic compound within this brew that's used in the Amazon and actually increasingly elsewhere in the world is dimethyltryptamine, DMT. Now, what do these compounds look like when you look at their molecular structure? Well, what's striking, actually, is especially when you look at psilocin, which is the metabolite of psilocybin. Psilocybin's the more stable compound that's found in the mushrooms, the magic mushrooms. But the compound that acts on, essentially, at a very basic level, acts on the brain is psilocin. Now, look how similar the molecular structure there is between psilocin and dimethyltryptamine. I'm going to show you another molecule here. This is serotonin, found widely in the body, mostly in the gut, incidentally, but we tend to know it best because of its occurrence in the brain and because of the range of different functions that serotonin modulates within the brain. Things like mood. Classically, we think of serotonin levels when they're high, we feel good. When they're low, we feel less good. That's quite a basic rule, but it's probably relatively robust. Also, a range of different functions, cognition, thinking, sleep, are all modulated by serotonin. So it's striking that these psychedelic drugs, these classic psychedelic drugs, are only subtly different from this naturally occurring brain chemical that's in all of our brains in this room at this moment, and that has such a crucial modulatory influence on our thinking, our mood, and our behavior. Now, in terms of the term psychedelic, what does it actually mean? Well, this was a word that was coined in the 1950s. It conjoins to ancient Greek word psyche for, most accurately, soul, and this other word that I often struggle with a little bit, its origin is delos, or delosei, I think. Maybe a Greek speaker could correct me. But essentially, this means to make visible or to make manifest or to reveal. So by their very definition, and this is a term that was coined by a British psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, in conversation with the famous author Aldous Huxley, by the very definition, class of drugs. And what does it mean? It means to reveal the soul or to reveal the mind. That's the origin of this term, psychedelic. Interest in the mind, that's naturally fascinating. It suggests we have a tool here that could be particularly powerful in terms of allowing us to explore, to investigate, and to understand the mind. And so why are this class of drugs important? Let's have some empirical research to support that. Well, some nice work has come out of Johns Hopkins in the US. They've looked at the effect of a single high dose of psilocybin, that's the compound found in magic mushrooms, on individuals who've never taken a psychedelic drug before. And they asked people both soon after the experience, but also over a year after the experience, how it would rate or how they'd rank it among other experiences in their lives. And they actually found that 2/3 of the sample rated their experience with psilocybin among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of the whole of their lives. And so that's useful to try and communicate to people who perhaps think maybe this area is a little trivial, a little strange, maybe not something to take entirely seriously. But this helps to communicate that actually, you know, these compounds have very interesting effects on the mind and the brain, and are therefore powerful tools, scientific tools, to understand these things. When put in a context, people would say, you know, other things in the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives, they would say things like the birth of their first child or the death of a family member, perhaps. Another thing that the researchers found was that, again, a large proportion rated the experience according to standard criteria for rating a mystical experience. A large proportion of them rated this as what's referred to as a complete mystical experience. So using criteria from things like spontaneous religious sort of revelatory experiences, things that might occur in the context of spiritual practice, meditation, retreats, and such like. They found that quite reliably, in fact, very reliably, they could produce these complete mystical experiences with just a single dose of psilocybin found in magic mushrooms. So as I've said, these compounds have profound and novel modulatory effects on consciousness, and that's really the reason why we think that they're interesting and important to study scientifically. So just to give a flavor of the kind of things that people report with psychedelic drugs, here are some quotes from some of our volunteers in our research. This is one saying that was real ego death stuff. And I'll sort of develop this idea later on, this notion of the ego and how it's affected by psychedelics. That was real ego death stuff. I only existed as a concept, as an idea, suggesting that normal subjectivity that we go through the world with seems to dissolve away under these drugs. Another one, the feeling of no boundaries. I did not know where I ended and my surroundings began. Somehow I was able to comprehend what oneness is. And I'll come back to this notion of oneness later on as well, and its relationship to the ego and the dissolution of the ego. Another one saying I was traveling in the spirit world. And this last one, there simply aren't words to describe it. There was a sense of beautiful chaos. Again, that's something I'll talk about, this notion of chaos in the mind and in the brain produced by these drugs. A landscape of unimaginable color and beauty. This was actually a patient who we treated with psilocybin for his treatment-resistant depression, who responded particularly well in that trial. I'll actually end the talk by telling you about some of the findings from that trial, which have just been going to be published in less than 2 weeks, so look out for that perhaps. So how do these drugs work in the brain? This is going to be the kind of meat of my talk, really. Again, to broach this question at a basic level, we know that a key system in the brain that is affected by these drugs is the serotonin system. It's that's targeted and modulated. And there's a particular aspect of the serotonin system. Serotonin has a range of these receptors. They're proteins that are on brain cells. And when serotonin comes along and binds to these proteins, depending on what receptor there is, and there's some 14 of these different serotonin receptors, the serotonin will modulate the behavior of that host cell. And so that mechanism can be hijacked by drugs, and often that's what That's what drugs that affect the brain do. They kind of hijack a natural system that's there. And what are the receptors that psychedelic drugs hijack? Well, it's these serotonin 2A receptors. And these 2A receptors, they're heavily expressed in the cortex of the brain, that most evolutionarily developed part of the brain that humans have so much of. And you can see this image here, which is a positron emission tomography image. It's a PET image. What you have is a radioactive ligand, a chemical that will bind to the serotonin 2A receptors. And because it's radioactive and we can sense that, we can identify where in the brain these serotonin 2A receptors are. This is a human brain, and you can see that there's a very heavy distribution in that outer part of the brain, the cortex, that humans have so much of. Why do we know that the 2A receptor is so important? Well, if you block it with another drug, what we call an antagonist or a blocker, then essentially the psychedelic is rendered ineffective. You don't have a psychedelic trip, so to speak. Another thing we know is that the higher the affinity of a psychedelic for the 2A receptor, the greater its potency. So the more sticky it is, and it serves as an agonist, that means it stimulates the receptor like serotonin would. The higher the affinity, the more sticky it is, the more potent is that compound. So for example, LSD, incredibly sticky and incredibly potent as well. So in terms of the work that we've been concentrating on at Imperial, we've been doing a lot of brain imaging research, brain scanning research, looking at functional brain activity, so that's ongoing brain activity. We look at things like the rhythms in the brain, the oscillatory rhythms. We use a technique called magnetoencephalography, or MEG, which gives us recordings of these different rhythms in the brain. And we also use something called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and that's a technique that allows us to look deeper into the brain. We don't have we can't see the faster activity that MEG can pick up, but the advantage of fMRI is that we can see deep into the brain. We can see right into the center of the brain. And we can look at things like brain network properties, how different regions in the brain talk to each other, how they communicate, and also different circuits in the brain and how they relate to each other. In terms of the subjective effects, the kind of name of the game with looking at how a drug works in the brain by using brain imaging is to try and make a mapping between the changes in the biological phenomena, the ongoing brain activity, and then the psychological phenomena. So it's an equally important matter is how we sample the psychology. And there's that classic scientific dilemma of knowing when to sample. If you're interested in an ongoing spontaneous phenomenon like the psychedelic state, then to come in and sample and ask how people are doing is an intervention, it's a perturbation, and it's going to change things. And so typically what we've done is we've allowed people to have their psychedelic trip, and then we've done the sampling after a certain period. And then we ask kind of in retrospect about the state they were in. We also are increasingly looking at the richer lived experience, first-person reports. I'm going to read one of those to you at the end of my talk. And I think that helps to kind of, although subjective ratings and these kind of things are good from a sort of quantitative scientific level, there's a certain richness in these first-person reports that's hard to get from those subjective ratings. So we're increasingly looking at those and using more sophisticated linguistic analyses to break them down and look at different structures within the language. So what about the results? So here's a first result that I'll take you through. It'll look quite complicated, but I'll describe it to you. First of all, we need to know the design of the study. So there were 20 healthy individuals in this particular study. They'd all had a previous experience with a psychedelic drug. That was a safety consideration. If the main focus is how do these drugs work in the brain, then why take the risk of having someone in the study who's never had a psychedelic before? So we have people in who we know can tolerate the effects of a psychedelic, and often we feel confident that they can tolerate the extra sort of stress that could be presented by going into a noisy brain scanner. So we're careful in our screening and our recruitment. This particular study was looking at the effects of LSD on the brain. We need a control condition, something to compare that LSD state with. So we use a placebo condition, we use an inert placebo so that we have a clean baseline with which to make a comparison. The individuals have both the drug experience, the LSD experience, and the placebo experience scan on separate days, and these scans are separated by 14 days, and we balance the order in which they get LSD and placebo, so half get LSD in their first scan, half will get it in their second. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a particular circuit in the brain, and I'll tell you about this circuit in the next slide. But just to show you the results, you can see a region in purple there. We call that a region of interest or a seed region. And what we ask with this analysis is where does that region, it's called the parahippocampus, it's involved in things like memory, autobiographical memory, scene construction, quite high-level cognitive functions, imagination and such like. And we ask the question, where in the brain is there strong communication between the seed region? We look at that in the LSD condition, and we look at it in the placebo condition, and then we do a subtraction. And what you're looking at here with this big brain, is the lighting okay? We don't want it down at the front, or is this as good as it gets? That's all right. So essentially we're seeing blue there. That means that the communication between the parahippocampus and this region in blue is less under LSD than under placebo. So that there's a decrease in the level of communication between the parahippocampus and this region. We call it the posterior cingulate cortex, or here on we'll call it the PCC for short, and I'll tell you why that region's important in a moment. But just to continue with the results, and that agenda, I suppose, that we have of making a mapping between the biology and the psychology, here we're looking at our participants' ratings of a particular phenomenon, which I'll talk about shortly, which is ego dissolution or ego disintegration. Quite difficult to fathom, but I'm going to try and deconstruct that later. And you can see that there's a relationship between the magnitude of the decrease in communication that we saw under LSD between the parahippocampus and this PCC region, and the magnitude of ego dissolution as it was rated under LSD. Now, when we find something like that, and really quite a strong relationship like this, and then we can compare it to things that we've seen previously, we sometimes think that we might have something, and there may be an important relationship here. But what about this particular circuit, this parahippocampal posterior cingulate cortex circuit? What kind of things is it involved in? Well, certain researchers have talked about things like internal models, how as we develop in this world, we tend to sample immediately from the sensorium, from the environment, and then as we go on and we become more sophisticated, we tend to internalize models, things that we've learnt about the world, and we sort of incorporate them into our minds, I suppose. Another very important team who've looked at these particular regions in this particular circuit is the team of Professor Maguire at UCL, Eleanor Maguire, and they've associated this particular circuit with functions like scene construction, mental imagery, so quite high level and arguably human-specific cognitive functions. There's another famous paper which talked about a proximal structure, the precuneus, as being the mind's eye, proximal, that is, to the PCC. And a recent review paper, quite a potentially definitive review paper on the neural correlates of consciousness, have referred to this region and, again, proximal regions as being a hot zone related to consciousness. That if we're going to try and look for some kind of seat, I don't really like that term, but this idea of a kind of biological substrate which is important and crucial for this very abstract thing that we call consciousness, then arguably there's no better place to look than this PCC posterior region. So an idea that I've been submitting recently is that if there's a split in this particular circuit, as we see that there is under LSD and also other psychedelic drugs, then maybe it relates to something important in terms of the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, particularly if it correlates with things like this dissolution of the sense of self or ego. So I've kind of proposing this idea that there's a kind of untethering, or that normal anchorage that an individual self has in their past, in their narrative, in their story, that gives them assuredness and confidence as they go through the world. Perhaps that anchorage, that firm anchorage that we ordinarily have, is slightly split in the psychedelic state, perhaps. Another idea is to think of subjective constancies. We can think of perceptual constancies. We can think of things like visual illusions, how our minds tend to see the bigger picture rather than the details. So if you can read this text, that kind of thing's going on. In psychology and cognitive neuroscience, we call it predictive coding, that propensity the mind has to see the bigger picture, really, rather than the individual details. So you can probably read it, and that's because you're seeing the bigger picture, you're seeing the whole words, rather than looking at the individual letters. So there's a similar idea if we think about the self, that sense of self that we have. We all give ourselves a name, or others give us a name, and we refer to ourselves often with I and these personal pronouns. Maybe that's a kind of subjective constancy, a kind of gestalt that we've constructed that we go through the world with, and perhaps that's disturbed in the psychedelic state. So just to develop that idea, this notion of the ego, which is difficult, as I've said, to kind of fathom, really. You only really get a sense of its existence by the loss of it, and that's why these psychedelics can be interesting tools to study it. And so we can refer to it as a constellation construct or an umbrella construct, something which sort of subsumes a number of different things like drive, personal narrative, our own story, our own sense of identity, our ability to reflect on ourselves, a sense of assuredness, that sense of subjectivity, our ability to reality test and not get carried away by fantasy, autobiographical memory and such like. And as I said, these personal pronouns kind of speak to this construct of the ego. And I heard recently something that was particularly nice, somebody talking about the psychedelic experience and the change in the sense of ego that you experience, and how it tells us something about our normal waking consciousness, this normal consciousness that it is so colored and influenced by the ego. And they said that ego consciousness, this normal consciousness that we have, has a focus, it has a direction and a purpose. He said it's consciousness with a point. And I quite like that. And if you look at things like Eastern philosophies, and you'll find similar descriptions of the loss of the self in things like meditation, you'll find that they'll talk about that kind of striving, seeking quality to normal waking consciousness and how this can dissolve away, for example, in meditative practices. At a conference I was at recently, an interesting chap, Anil Seth at University of Sussex, who's a strong advocate of this predictive coding model of how the brain works, gave this interesting take on Descartes' little phrase, I think, therefore I am. And he said that in thinking about the sense of self and its existence and its construction, we could adapt Descartes' phrase and say, I predict myself, therefore I am. So there's something in kind of constructing and consolidating through prediction, really, our sense of self that kind of perhaps validates our own existence in the world and may be the reason that we do that. Also, you could think of someone like Donald Trump, who perhaps, or any politician really, or anyone, all of us, and the way that we, through our behaviors and who we think we are and such like, tend to kind of consolidate our identities, you know, and notions of nation and such like, and how when we incorporate these into our psyche, they almost kind of give us that assuredness and sort of evidence, if you want, for our own existence, like we're really real and important. So what we tried to do at Imperial, because this material is so difficult, it is very high level. You thought this was going to be fun, didn't you? Because it is so high level and difficult to unpack, we're trying quite hard to do that at Imperial. And so we're trying to develop an inventory, a rating scale for this experience of ego dissolution. And to do that, we've come up with 8 different items that we felt spoke to this experience. Things like, I experienced a dissolution of myself or ego. I felt at one with the universe. Out of curiosity and actually with a prior sort of prediction, really, we threw in some arguably sort of orthogonal, if not sort of opposite experiences or feelings. Things like, I felt especially assertive. I felt more important or special than others. My ego felt inflated. We ran a particular analysis, you call it a principal components analysis, that look at how these different items relate to each other. You can identify different factors or dimensions in the data where items sort of coalesce and belong to particular factors or dimensions. We ran that and we found this strong 2-factor structure where items either loaded onto this ego dissolution factor or they loaded onto another one that we called ego inflation. And then to kind of put this into practice, we looked at different states. And because we're psychopharmacologists, we thought we'd look at drug states. And we thought we'd pick drugs that are familiar to a lot of people. So we looked at psychedelics, we looked at cocaine, and we looked at alcohol. And then in blue, you have, what we did is we asked people to report on a typical experience with one or all of these drugs, and then to provide us with the estimated dose that they took, and then to think retrospectively how they would rate on these different items of ego dissolution and ego inflation. We found that there was a strong positive relationship between the dose of LSD that was taking, or equivalent, psychedelic equivalent dose of LSD, so it could be any classic psychedelic drug, and ego dissolution. So the higher the dose of a psychedelic, the greater was this experience of ego dissolution. When we looked at ego inflation, that's in red there, we didn't see a significant relationship. Then we looked at cocaine, and we found an entirely opposite relationship. So the higher the dose of cocaine, the greater was actually ego inflation, and there wasn't a relationship with ego dissolution. So those items like I felt especially assured, I felt more important or special than others. When looking at these different drug states, the more cocaine you take, the more you'll load onto this particular experience. Then we looked at alcohol because everyone takes it. Imagine you've all taken this particular drug, and we didn't find a relationship between either ego dissolution and the dose in terms of units of alcohol taken, or actually ego inflation. So it was useful as a kind of comparator there. And if we can look at other states, maybe we might be able to identify that, at least in terms of drug experiences, there might be a specific relationship between psychedelics and the psychedelic experience, and this interesting, but as I've often said, difficult to unpack and describe experience of ego dissolution. But, you know, I'm not sure what proportion of people, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up, have taken a psychedelic drug in your lifetime. But I imagine that there'll be people in the room who have tried meditation and this kind of thing. And so they may have some notion and idea of what it would be like to have a mystical or spiritual type experience. So what we did in this particular analysis, we looked at the relationship between our ego dissolution inventory that we were developing and a standard classic measure of the mystical experience, and we found a strong positive relationship. Now, what kind of items make up the mystical experience questionnaire? You have things like the experience of fusion of your personal self or ego into a larger whole, or the experience of the insight that all is one. So scholars who've looked at the mystical experience, the like of William James and particularly Walter Stace, have identified this particular aspect of the mystical experience that they call the unitive experience, that sense of oneness, and looking at a range of different religions, identifying and spiritual practices, forgetting about psychedelic drugs, finding that this unitive experience, this sense of oneness, is the kind of essential thing in the mystical or spiritual type experience, however we frame it in terms of the religious dogma that can go with that experience. So it's interesting that there's a relationship there. But to return to the brain imaging data, I said at the start, the psychology is as important really as the biology. We're trying to communicate how these drugs work in the brain. But let's return to that mapping between the biology and the psychology. This time looking at psilocybin. This study had 15 healthy volunteers. We give 2 milligrams of psilocybin intravenously. That's a moderate dose. I should have said that the dose of LSD that we give is moderate as well. And we compare it with placebo, which is a saline infusion, so inert, but nevertheless controlling for the rest of the conditions, the experimental conditions. Now, what we're looking at here is a change in a particular rhythm in the brain. We call it the alpha rhythm. Incidentally, it's a rhythm that's particularly prominent in humans relative to other species, and it's particularly prominent in adults as well. So there are things that are suggestive there that there might be something interesting in terms of this particular rhythm, in terms of our own psychology and high-level functions that we have, such as having a sense of self and having this thing that we call consciousness. Now, what we found in this particular analysis was that the greater the collapse of that rhythm, the greater were ratings of ego dissolution. So this is kind of fleshing out what we're gleaning, both about how you can modulate the sense of self or ego under a psychedelic, but it's not just telling you about what the psychedelic's doing and how it's working in the brain. It's telling us about the neural substrates of the sense of self or ego in a way, irregardless of psychedelics. It's telling us about that baseline state, because that's the other side of the coin, right? That's the other aspect of the comparison. So that's, you know, in a sort of defensive kind of way, why it's important to do this research, that we're learning not just about psychedelic consciousness, we're learning a lot about consciousness itself. And just to say, you could see this chart on the right. This is doing a similar kind of analysis, but this time with LSD, which is a similar compound to psilocybin, and essentially finding a similar thing, a drop in alpha, in the alpha rhythm, again in this posterior cingulate cortex region of the brain. I don't think I've got a pointer, but it's this part of the brain. Can you see the cursor? Yeah. And here's the normal sort of power spectrum. So this is alpha. You can see it's a very dominant rhythm. There's a lot of it. It's very prominent ordinarily in the placebo condition. This is the LSD condition. You can see it's slightly sped up and dramatically sort of flattened. Much less of this normally very prominent rhythm. I'm going to tell you what that might mean in a moment, but before I do, another thing that we've found is that a particular brain network, it's called the default mode network. If there's, in terms of spatial coordinates, the best candidate for the sort of neural substrates of the sense of self or ego, then it would probably be this default mode network that offers us that. We know it's related to things like self-reflection, theory of mind, very high level, arguably species-specific functions. Now we found that the greater the disintegration of this particular network, the greater were people's ratings, again, of this experience of ego dissolution. Now you can see the bottom half of this slide, we're looking at something slightly different. This isn't the integrity of a particular brain network. This is kind of the integrity of the brain as a whole. So this is a more sort of holistic analysis. We're looking at the whole of the brain. What we're seeing under psilocybin is that ordinarily communities in the brain, you can see these different colors. Let's think of this as, for example, the visual system, and these blobs as regions within the visual system. It's quite hard to see, but ordinarily the communication is kind of confined or restricted to these particular communities. So visual regions talk mostly only with other visual regions. There isn't much crosstalk with other communities in the brain. There's some, but there's not so much. Then look at psilocybin, and there's this crazy party going on in the brain. Regions in the brain that ordinarily don't talk to each other, talking to each other much more, and a lot of kind of blending going on in terms of functions that are normally disparate, beginning to influence each other. We found a similar thing with LSD here. It looks slightly more complicated, but essentially the message is the same. So in terms of the whole of the brain, we're seeing a kind of increase in integrity. Another way to say that is the brain's normally sort of parcellated off into different specialized systems, doing their specialized functions in a sophisticated and precise kind of way. If you look at the psychedelic state, that separation, that segregation is lost to an extent. A way I like to describe it is that there's a kind of desegregation in the brain. So there's much more free talk going on between these regions that normally don't talk to each other so much. So whether we talk about it as a global integration or desegregation, essentially they're synonymous things. So we'll see a disintegration within particular networks like the default mode network. We look at the whole of the brain and we're seeing a kind of increase in integrity. Now, what would an experience like global integration map onto in terms of the psychology? So this is really just in the realm of a hypothesis at the moment. But one idea might be that if there is a breakdown in, for example, that subject-object duality that we ordinarily have, a sense that we're a self, separate from other selves, separate from the rest of the world, and that breaks down on a psychedelic, and all of a sudden we feel that we're at one with the world, then when you see a breakdown in the segregation between systems in the brain, such as a system that subserves that sense of subjectivity or self, and then systems that are perhaps concerned with focus on the outside world, then maybe we're onto something there, and there's a mapping there. And that's something that we're going to look at increasingly as we go along. Another way to think about the psychedelic experience is to think about it in terms of evolution, both in terms of, I suppose, I always get these terms mixed up, but ontogenetic development, so going from birth into adulthood and the normal development of the brain, but also the development of the species as well. And then to entertain this idea that maybe there's a kind of regression in the psychedelic state, that maybe in the psychedelic state people may behave in a sort of childish way, things may seem sort of silly and funny, there may be a greater fluidity in consciousness and cognition, perhaps imagination is more vivid and fluid, associations similarly are more vivid and fluid, perhaps emotion is more labile, more changeable. You might go from being captivated and in a blissful state to all of a sudden, you know, crying your eyes out and having a tantrum. So I think there are some interesting mappings between these states, also that vulnerability that you'll see in children, and also a vulnerability, especially if you think about the therapeutic application of these drugs, that vulnerability that you'll see in that context. And that's another reason I have to fit this in, that, you know, don't try this at home, because when we give these compounds in our scientific research and when we give them therapeutically, we do it under very careful conditions. We carefully screen our volunteers, we look after them very carefully during the experience, and we prepare them, particularly in the therapeutic studies, and we help them integrate the experience afterwards. But these processes of integration and segregation are things that you ordinarily see in the brain as we develop, as we mature. You're seeing a reversal of that under psychedelics in a direction that's kind of regressive. And there's a lot of evidence that the brain develops integrity of particular systems, but also segregation as we develop. And I've provided those references at the bottom of this slide. So I think it's a useful kind of analogy for thinking about the psychedelic experience. Another thing that's worth thinking about is, if this is true, then might that suggest that there's a kind of mystical or spiritual quality to infant consciousness? And that's something that was talked about by the likes of William Wordsworth, and he has this poem, Imitations of Immortality, and a particular few lines of that kind of speak to this notion and are quite beautiful, I think. And so they're here. So this particular line of "Heaven lies about us in our infancy, shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy." And another piece of text that speaks to the kind of underlying mechanics here, from a nice paper by the developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik, and I'll read it to you. It says that adults and children may differ in the strengths of their commitments, with children holding more diffuse beliefs. The possibility is consistent with the difference between a low temperature and a high temperature system, to borrow an analogy from statistical physics, adults have congealed in their beliefs and are hard to shift. You might think of something like depression as being an example of that, while children are more fluid and consequently more willing to entertain new ideas. So this measure that's applied in statistical physics and thermodynamics and information theory of entropy is also something that kind of works on a psychological level. And entropy really is a measure of our uncertainty about a system, its unpredictability. Now we can think about the psychedelic state and perhaps the infant state as being a state where things are unpredictable, where we don't have that assuredness that we develop when we enter that prison house of adulthood. So it's interesting as a measure, but also as a kind of analogy for what happens in the psychedelic experience, that there's a kind of disintegration, a kind of introduction of fluidity and possibility, and what that maps onto in terms of that loss of assuredness and that entering into a state of uncertainty and fluidity, a higher entropy state that you would see both in the psychedelic state, perhaps in the infant state as well. And this is a slide I made about 10 minutes before my talk, which is never a good idea, but this notion, this way of characterizing the psychedelic experience as chaos is only so good, I think. And this quote I picked up on from Carl Jung recently, that in all chaos there is cosmos, in all disorder, a secret disorder. I think if the psychedelic state, just like the infant state, was just noise, it wouldn't be interesting. And what you see, for example, when you give these compounds in therapeutic work, is a kind of sort of secret order, these sort of emergence, these moments of emerging order, perhaps insights of a kind of philosophical nature, things related to that sense of oneness, perhaps that the ego is a construct, or there may be more personal insights, perhaps how we relate to other people, how perhaps we're going wrong in our lives, and this kind of thing. Just to bring us back down to earth, I'm going to end now with some slides and some discussion of our therapeutic work with psychedelics, and specifically psilocybin, the compound in magic mushrooms. And so what kind of things motivated and what kind of evidences supported us doing this quite challenging clinical trial? So if you look at a very low level, let's look at work in non-human animals. And it's been found that if you stimulate the serotonin 2A receptor, you can promote cognitive flexibility and also learning. And if you block that receptor, you can retard, you can impair those things. It's also been found that a serotonin 2A receptor agonist that would have psychedelic properties in humans doubles a particular marker of neural plasticity, or the growth of new synaptic connections in the rodent brain in the cortex. So doubling of this thing called BDNF in the cortex with 2A receptor, serotonin 2A receptor stimulation. And so that and some of our own brain imaging work, looking at particular circuits and how sort of pathological overactivity, for example, in certain regions can be normalized by psilocybin, as it can be by a range of different antidepressants. All this work helped us win a Medical Research Council grant to do a feasibility study looking at psilocybin as a treatment for major depression. So this was an open label trial. That's a major caveat. It's worth bearing in mind. That means that there was no placebo control in this particular study. We were looking at feasibility, really, and gaining an impression of efficacy as a prelude to what we call a randomized control trial, where we'll have a placebo arm. It's treatment-resistant major depression, so that means that the patients recruited to the trial had tried at least 2 different antidepressant medications of different classes that hadn't worked within their current depressive episode. We give 2 doses of psilocybin, what we call a low dose, 10 milligrams, and then what we believe is the treatment, the therapeutic dose, 25 milligrams, which is quite a high dose of psilocybin. intended to produce these kind of mystical or spiritual type experiences, and these sessions are separated by 1 week. We do careful preparation with our patients who are very carefully screened. We look after them. We have 2 mental health professionals, either psychiatrists or a clinical psychologist we have with the patient at all times, and we have quite thorough integration work afterwards as well, talking through the experience. We also incorporate brain imaging. I'm not going to present that, but we have done that, and we're just getting the analyses processed at the moment. So here are the results. It was quite a dramatic effect 1 week post-treatment. This is important because standard antidepressants can take a few weeks to kind of kick in a way and start to have an effect. But the antidepressant effect with psilocybin seems to be rapid, and you can see a bit of bounce back at 3 months, and sort of not much more really at sort of people going either way at 6 months. If you run a statistical analysis on these, the effect size, which is a kind of indicator of the magnitude of the effect, we can run our standard t-tests and get our p-values. I should say that all the contrast versus baseline are highly significant, but perhaps the more interesting thing is how big is the effect, and perhaps how would you compare that with other treatments, albeit with the caveat that we didn't have a placebo arm in this study. Well, actually, it's a huge effect. It was an effect size. It's conventional to think of an effect size of 0.8 and above as large. Placebo meta-analyses, that means the pooling of a lot of studies. The effect size of placebo is about 1 in clinical trials. Antidepressant medications, psychotherapy, about 1.5, slightly over. We were seeing effect sizes of 3.2 or 3.3, 1 week and 2 week post-treatment. Everyone except 1 patient in the full 20 showed some improvement 1 week post-treatment. Remember, these are patients who've often had depression for most of their adult lives. I think the average duration is between 15 and 20 years for the duration of their depression. So something clearly is happening. And you do see some relapse, so this isn't a golden bullet. Certainly, this is a sort of feasibility study. It's very, very early days. There's a lot more to do, both in terms of testing in a more rigorous way how effective this is, but also learning how to optimize this particular treatment. So there are things that we picked up on that we think we could do actually much better in terms of treating the patients and looking after them. Remember also that there's a kind of synergy going on here, both a treatment that works on a pharmacological level, a chemical effect at the level of brain receptors, but also something happening at a psychological level. So this isn't just psilocybin, this is psilocybin with psychological support. And so the next trial will allow us to glean how important and how significant is that psychological support element if we have the same level of psychological support in the placebo arm. But nevertheless, these results, for me especially, are very exciting and quite promising. We need to keep our feet on the ground, but nevertheless, at least it justifies more research. Now, I've highlighted a patient here because for the last 2 minutes, I'm going to read a little vignette from this particular patient, because I think you should get an idea of the kind of thing that people were experiencing in these trials. So I've got it so that it's anonymous and not personally identifying. This patient is female in her early 40s, has had her depression since her teens. Just before my talk, I was looking up the demographic sheet that we have to see how many antidepressants she'd tried, and it was 8. That hadn't worked for her within her life. And so she was the one I showed you on the previous slide in blue, bit of a blip at 3 months, but back down into, that's remission actually below 5 at 6 months. So looking okay for her. So I'll read you her vignette, and then I think I'll end there, and hopefully there might be time for a couple of questions. So it goes as follows. The first thing that I noticed after the medication began taking effect was an energy buzzing through my body, then numbness, especially on my left side. I did not see any visuals or colors, I just experienced this feeling. I should say this is on the high dose, the second session of the psilocybin. Next, I saw my grand aunt's home in incredible detail. The house burned down 10 years ago and was in disrepair for 10 years prior to that. But the images were of the house the way it was during my childhood. Typically, patients lie with their eyes closed and listen to music. That's the kind of default conditions in the trial. My aunt died in 95, was approximately 80 years old. She'd married, but her husband died when she was in her 40s, and she never remarried or had children. She always impressed me as quite a lonely, bitter woman, and I think I've been worried about becoming like her as I get older. Because I'm unmarried, I don't have children, and I spend the majority of my time alone. In the next stage, I recall having slow, rigid, methodical movements in my legs and feet, and this is something quite interesting to watch. She was sort of moving her legs up and down in a sort of marching kind of way. And we were curious about what was going on, but we just let her go with the flow of the experience. She says, I felt that I was walking with great effort, and it was not voluntary, it was compulsive. I had to keep going even though I wanted to stop. I saw images of people suffering and walking to flee violence, refugees, or being forced to march, Jewish prisoners during World War II, in brackets. I remember feeling incredibly sad and crying a bit. I looked up to the heavens and questioned God as to why there was so much suffering, and I pointed my finger at God in an accusatory gesture for allowing these things to happen. In hindsight, I think that this walking, marching represented that despite suffering, we must keep going. We can never give up, and this is a basic part of our human nature. I then heard this voice, first very masculine and very strong, and it told me how much it loved me. And I knew that this was the absolute truth. It told me that although there is much suffering in the world, there is so much joy as well. The voice told me to focus more on the joy and beauty of life, not just the suffering. It told me that I have great compassion. Consequently, I take on too much responsibility for others. As human beings, we should care for each other, but everyone gives a little. It also said I have a great capacity to experience joy, and I need to concentrate more on this. It told me that there is a balance between suffering and beauty in life, and I should seek balance in my life. I then heard a more feminine voice, but it was the same spirit or essence. Both voices referred to me as my darling and spoke in a very loving tone. The female voice gave me advice about life. She told me to love everyone, but be clear about who I am and what I believe. She told me I should not let anyone or society define me, dare to be different. She told me that life is all about choices, and she wants me to choose to be happy. I must choose happiness. She kissed my cheeks and used my hands to show my muscles how to smile, shaping my face. She told me to walk with my head held high and tapped under my chin, pushing it up. She told me to always trust my intuition. She told me not to eat land animals. Fish okay, in brackets. That's convenient. She told me not to forget to laugh. She told me jokes and teased me about my sense of humor. She told me, despite my sadness, this had not been lost. She told me to hold on to my faith. This was a religious lady, Jewish, and pray. She told me not to worry so much about my health and joked that by the time the psilocybin session ended, my blood pressure would be down to 120 over 80. So finally, she told me some things about my life. This is the last sentence or two, that like the fact I won't live alone, I'll marry in the future. Sensing my skepticism, she joked that humans always have to see things before they will believe, and she told me, you will see, my darling. As the experience ended, she told me that I should dance, and I danced my head, moving my legs to the music as the medicine gently wore off. Well, that brought back a few memories for me, to be honest, and it was quite a powerful experience, that particular one. Incidentally, she was our first patient, and I remember we were saying to each other after she went through it that it was almost too good to be true. I think that's kind of borne out. Now that we've done 20 patients, it feels as though, yes, this is promising, but like I said earlier, it's not so simple. It doesn't always flow so easily. And this particular patient, as I said, did have that significant blip at 3 months. So it kind of emphasizes, I think you can probably see some of the vulnerability in there as well. It emphasizes the importance of that psychological component and how these are incredibly potent and powerful substances that aren't recreational drugs. They don't really fit the standard criteria for recreational drugs. They're not Moorish, they're not addictive. Animals won't self-administer them. Humans typically would take them at most every sort of few months, really. They're not something like cigarettes that you take every day or caffeine or whatever. So they don't really fit that classic mold, really, of a recreational rewarding drug. But nevertheless, you know, there are potential risks there. So what is the serotonin 2A receptor for? I think it's quite nice sometimes to talk about the high-level psychology. It's a kind of reminder of the richness of what is there to study in terms of psychedelics. To talk about that high-level psychology and then bring it back down to our knowledge that we know what particular serotonin receptor these compounds work on. And so given that these receptors are there, they're there ordinarily, they're there in all our brains, what might they be there for? And so it's interesting to entertain the idea that they may be there for change, perhaps sudden, perhaps dramatic change, perhaps when conditions make that necessary. And this is a quote that I'll end with from George Bernard Shaw. I really should read some of his work because it's a great quote. And it says, those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. With that, I'd like to thank David Nutt and those who've supported the research and the broad team that have all played such an important role in making this happen. And thank you for your attention.